The mysterious cry. James stood at the edge of the alien desert, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. The sky above was a deep shade of purple, with stars scattered like silver dust across an endless stretch of night. The wind howled through the jagged rocks, carrying a strange chill that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He pulled his jacket tighter around his body, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The mission was supposed to be simple. A routine checkup on a newly discovered planet, one that had recently been deemed habitable for human life. But this place, this world, felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, like the planet was holding its breath. James had been part of countless space missions before, but nothing had ever made him feel like this. The silence was unnerving. The other members of the team, busy setting up their camp in the rocky terrain, didn't seem to notice. They were more focused on their equipment, their instruments, and the task at hand. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the wind, but it grew louder, piercing through the calm night like a scream of pure terror. James froze, his heart racing. It wasn't the sound of an animal or a natural event. It was something alive. The scream echoed through the rocky canyon, bouncing off the sharp cliffs that surrounded them. It was high-pitched, desperate, and full of fear. James turned his head, looking around, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. His teammates hadn't heard it. They continued working, oblivious to the haunting cry that filled the air. James's curiosity got the better of him. He had to know where that scream came from. He moved toward the direction of the sound, his boots crunching on the rocky ground beneath him. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the landscape. The rock formations loomed like dark giants, their twisted shapes creating strange shadows. He walked for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. The farther he went, the louder the scream became. It seemed to be echoing off the rocks, but there was no sign of the source. It was as if the very land itself was alive, responding to the cry. James's instincts told him to turn back, but something deep within him urged him forward. The scream was different now, more frantic, more desperate. It was a cry for help. He could feel it in his bones. Whoever, or whatever, it was in pain, and it needed someone to save it. He reached a narrow pass between two massive rock walls. The moonlight barely reached here, and the air was thick with dust. James stopped in his tracks, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the dark, was a figure. A shape, barely visible in the shadows, was huddled against the rock. It was small, fragile, and alone. The figure let out another scream, this one even weaker than the last. James's heart pounded in his chest as he took a cautious step forward. He couldn't see clearly in the darkness, but there was something about the figure that made his blood run cold. "Hello," James called out, his voice shaky. Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. It just trembled, a low whimper escaping its lips. It was almost like the creature didn't understand his language, or maybe it was too weak to respond. James's mind raced. What was this? An alien? Had he stumbled upon something dangerous? But the screams, they didn't sound like the voice of an enemy. They sounded like the voice of someone, or something, desperate for help. He took another step, reaching out with a trembling hand. As he got closer, the figure slowly turned its head, revealing a pair of large, round eyes. They were wide with fear, and they gleamed in the darkness like two small stars. The creature was humanoid, but it had strange features, skin the color of midnight, hair that seemed to shimmer like starlight, and a slender, fragile frame. James's breath caught in his throat. The creature wasn't just an alien. It was a girl. A young girl, no older than 12, if that. Her body was covered in bruises and cuts, as though she had been through something terrible. Her eyes locked with James's, and for a moment, he saw something in them. Something that made him feel a wave of protectiveness he couldn't explain. She opened her mouth to speak, But no words came out. Instead, she let out another soft cry, a pitiful sound that sent a shiver down James's spine. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help," James said, his voice gentle. He crouched down beside her, trying to offer comfort. But the girl flinched away, her body tense, as if she didn't trust him. James paused, trying to assess the situation. He knew he had to be careful. This could be a trap. The alien species on this planet had a reputation for being hostile, and the last thing he needed was to fall into an ambush. But the scream, it had felt real. The girl's fear had felt real. She wasn't attacking him. She was just scared, alone, and hurt. And in that moment, James made a choice. He wasn't going to leave her. "I'm not going to hurt you," James said, his voice soft but firm. "I just want to help." The girl looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Then, slowly, she nodded. A strange encounter. James knelt down in the moonlight, his fingers trembling as they hovered near the young alien girl. Her big dark eyes watched him closely, her body still trembling with fear. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, a spark of hope, flickering faintly beneath the surface. She seemed so fragile, so small in this vast alien world, and yet there was an intensity about her that James couldn't quite understand. "Don't be afraid," James murmured, trying to calm her. He had encountered many alien species during his time in the service, but this was different. This creature, this girl, was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Her skin, the color of deep space, shimmered under the pale light of the moons. It was smooth but faintly translucent, as if it reflected the stars themselves. Her eyes were enormous, far larger than any human's, giving her an almost childlike, vulnerable appearance. She looked like a being from a dream, fragile and yet somehow ancient. James's thoughts raced as he slowly extended his hand toward her, careful not to make any sudden movements. "My name's James," he said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl didn't speak, but her eyes flickered with something. A recognition, maybe, or just the beginning of trust. She didn't flinch away when James's fingers brushed against her arm, which was surprisingly cold to the touch. He gently tried to help her sit up, and she winced, but didn't protest. She was hurt, that much was clear. Her body was covered in bruises and cuts, as though she had been through something violent, something she couldn't escape. James felt his heart tighten. Whatever had happened to her, it had to be bad. The desperation in her scream, the way she had clung to life, like it was slipping away from her. It was all too real. But what could he do? He was just a soldier, a part of a small, unprepared team sent to survey this unknown world. He wasn't a medic, and he didn't know how to treat alien wounds. But one thing was certain. He couldn't just leave her here. There was something in his gut that told him she wasn't just another alien to be studied, another specimen to be cataloged. She was alive, and she needed help. And somehow, despite all the risks, he couldn't turn his back on her. Where are you from?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't expecting an answer. He had no idea if she even understood him, let alone spoke any human language. But he had to try. The unknown was always more frightening than the known, and understanding her, even in small ways, might help him keep her safe. The girl blinked slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. Then, to James's surprise, she spoke, softly, as though the words were foreign to her. "Lyra." "Lyra," James repeated, his voice filled with wonder. The name sounded like a song, like something ancient and powerful. It felt important. "Where are you from, Lyra? How did you get here?" Lyra's gaze shifted to the rocks around them, her lips pressing together in a thin line. She shuddered, as if just remembering whatever it was that had brought her here was too painful. She didn't speak again, but James could tell that the words she wanted to say were locked inside her. She wasn't ready, or maybe she couldn't speak of it. James sat beside her, carefully keeping his distance, not wanting to crowd her. He noticed now that she wasn't just physically hurt. She was exhausted, drained, as though her body had been through some kind of relentless ordeal. There was an emptiness in her eyes that spoke volumes. She had been through something terrible, something far beyond just physical pain. Whatever had happened to her, it had broken something deep inside her. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying the distant hum of their camp. It was clear that James couldn't stay here forever. His team would be looking for him. They would wonder where he had gone. But how could he just leave Lyra? She was alone on this barren, unforgiving planet, with nothing but a past she couldn't, or wouldn't, share. "Are you the last of your people?" James asked gently, trying to make sense of the little he had seen. The girl's head dropped slightly at the question, her eyes growing darker as though the weight of his words had struck a painful chord. She didn't answer, but the way she curled in on herself, hugging her knees closer to her chest, said everything. He wanted to reach out and offer her comfort, but he didn't know how. What words could he possibly say to make her feel safe? He had always been good at following orders, at solving problems with action. But this was different. This was a person who needed more than just help. She needed understanding, something James didn't know if he could give her. As James sat there in silence, his mind raced. He knew he had to take Lyra back to camp, but the question was how. His team was bound to have questions, questions that James didn't even have answers to yet. Who was she? What was her species? Why had she screamed for help? And what did it mean for humanity's future? But those questions would have to wait. First, he had to get her to safety. "Come on," James said softly, standing up and offering his hand once more. "We need to get you back to camp. You're safe now. I promise." For a moment, Lyra just stared at his outstretched hand, as if unsure whether to trust him. But then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. It was small, fragile, and trembling, but it was real. She was real. And despite the strange, alien world around them, James made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't going to leave her behind. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not while he was there. The journey back to camp would not be easy. But with Lyra by his side, James knew that nothing would stop him from keeping her safe. They walked together, side by side, as the alien night stretched endlessly before them, and for the first time in a long time, James felt the weight of his mission shift. This was no longer just a survey. This was something far more important. And it had only just begun. Language barrier. James walked carefully through the rocky terrain, leading Lyra back toward his team's camp. The alien night stretched around them, vast and silent, with only the occasional whisper of the wind breaking the stillness. The moons hummed low in the sky, casting a soft, silver glow over the landscape. Every few steps, James glanced back at Lyra, watching how she moved, slow, cautious, as if expecting danger at every turn. She was still afraid. James couldn't blame her. Whatever had happened to her before he found her must have been terrifying. She was wounded, exhausted, and completely alone on this desolate planet. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and unspoken, like an invisible wall between them. She followed him, but she didn't trust him. Not yet. As they neared the camp, James slowed his pace. He had no idea how his team would react to Lyra. Bringing an unknown alien, especially one who had been screaming for help in the dead of night, wasn't exactly in the mission plan. His team was trained for exploration, not first contact. He had no way of knowing if they would see Lyra as a threat or an ally. He turned to her, holding up a hand to signal her to stop. She hesitated but obeyed, watching him carefully. "I need to talk to my team first," James said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "They don't know about you yet. I don't want them to be scared." Lyra tilted her head slightly, her large, dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. It was clear she didn't understand his words, but she was watching his face, reading his expressions, trying to make sense of his meaning. James sighed. This was going to be difficult. He crouched down in front of her, trying to find a way to communicate. He pointed to himself. "James," he said, tapping his chest. "James." Lyra blinked, then hesitated before copying the gesture. "Ja-mes," she repeated, her voice soft, uncertain. James felt a small smile tug at the corner of his lips. It was progress. He pointed to her. "Lyra," he said. She hesitated again, then placed a hand over her chest. "Lyra," she said quietly. James nodded, encouraging her. "Yes, Lyra." Her lips parted slightly in surprise, as if realizing that, in some small way, they had just understood each other. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Encouraged, James decided to try something else. He pointed toward the camp, then mimicked walking with his fingers, hoping she would understand they needed to move forward. Lyra followed his hand movements carefully, her gaze shifting between his fingers and his face. After a moment, she gave a small nod. James exhaled in relief. This was going better than he had expected. Carefully, he led her closer to the camp, keeping his steps slow so she wouldn't feel pressured. As they neared the flickering lights of the settlement, James saw the figures of his teammates moving around. He took a deep breath. It was time. First contact. The moment James stepped into the clearing, his team noticed him. "James," a voice called out. It was Captain Reynolds, the team leader. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face lined from years of experience. "Where the hell have you been? You disappeared without a—" His voice cut off abruptly as he spotted Lyra behind James. Instantly, the mood in the camp shifted. The other crew members turned, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Tension crackled in the air like a live wire. "Stand down," James said quickly, raising his hands. "She's not a threat." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "What the hell is that?" "She's not a that," James said firmly. "Her name is Lyra. She was in trouble. I couldn't just leave her." The rest of the team exchanged uneasy glances. They had trained for all kinds of scenarios, but this wasn't one of them. First contact with an unknown species was supposed to be handled by diplomats and scientists, not by a small group of surveyors on an uncharted planet. Lyra shrank back slightly, sensing the tension. Her hands clenched into fists, and she took a half step behind James, using him as a shield. James could feel the fear radiating off her, but he also saw something else. Determination. She wasn't just scared. She was preparing herself, just in case. "James," Reynolds said slowly, his voice calm but firm. "We don't know anything about her. We don't know if she's dangerous. We don't know what she is." James clenched his jaw. "She's a scared kid," he shot back. She was alone. She was hurt. And she was screaming for help. "I don't care what she is. She needed someone." Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "This is a bad idea." "I don't think so," James said. "But if you really want to find out, why don't we try asking her?" Reynolds sighed but nodded. "Fine. Let's see if we can communicate." James turned back to Lyra, kneeling so he was at her eye level again. He pointed at himself. "James," he repeated, then pointed at Reynolds. "Reynolds." Lyra hesitated, then looked at Reynolds. "Reynolds," she said slowly. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Well, I'll be damned." Encouraged, James pointed to the camp. "Safe," he said, patting his chest, then pointing to Lyra. "Safe." Lyra's gaze flickered with something. Hesitation, doubt, but also the tiniest glimmer of understanding. Then, slowly, she lifted a trembling hand and pointed to herself. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "Danger." James felt his stomach drop. The word wasn't a question. It wasn't something she was asking. It was a statement. Danger. Lyra wasn't talking about herself. She was talking about what was coming. The warning. The moment Lyra spoke, James felt the shift in the air. The camp, the rocky landscape, the silent night. It all suddenly felt too still, too quiet. Then, Just as the realization hit him, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, low sound rumbled through the air, distant but unmistakable. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something else. Something alive. James shot to his feet. "We need to move. Now." Reynolds looked at him. "What's going on?" James turned back to Lyra, his heart pounding. She was shaking now, her body tensed as if preparing for the worst. She looked up at James, her eyes filled with silent warning. Something was coming, and it wasn't friendly. Uncovering the truth. A cold wind howled through the rocky canyon as James felt the ground beneath him tremble. The air was thick with tension, and Lyra's warning echoed in his mind. Danger. She wasn't speaking about herself. She wasn't the threat. Something else was out there, lurking in the darkness, and it was closing in fast. Reynolds was barking orders, motioning for the team to secure their positions. The rest of the crew, 6 men and 2 women, scrambled for their weapons, their instincts trained to prepare for the worst. No one doubted James now. The distant rumbling, the eerie stillness in the air. It was enough to make even the most skeptical among them take his warning seriously. James turned back to Lyra, who stood frozen in place, her body stiff, her breathing uneven. She wasn't just afraid. She was reliving something. A memory, a nightmare that had once been real. "Lyra," James said softly, gripping her shoulders gently. "What's coming? What are we up against?" Her large, shimmering eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, James saw something deeper than fear. He saw sorrow. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the horizon, where the jagged cliffs met the sky. Her voice came out in a whisper. "Hunters." James stiffened. "Hunters? What do you mean?" Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, struggling to find the words. Her species clearly didn't speak much of his language, but she was trying. She placed a hand on her chest, as if searching for the strength to continue, then finally spoke. "They took everyone." James felt a chill crawl up his spine. Before he could ask anything else, the distant rumbling grew louder, morphing into something distinct. Footsteps. Giant footsteps. The kind that could only come from something massive. And then, through the darkness of the canyon, the first shadow appeared. The hunters. At first, it was just a silhouette, barely visible against the jagged rocks. But as it moved, stepping into the pale moonlight, James felt his breath hitch. The creature was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, its body covered in dark, chitinous armor that gleamed under the light. Its long, clawed arms twitched, and its head was elongated, smooth, with no visible eyes. But it didn't need them. The moment it turned its head toward them, James felt an unmistakable pressure, like something was reaching into his mind, searching, testing. It wasn't alone. From the darkness behind it, more figures emerged. At least half a dozen, maybe more. Each one as tall and imposing as the first, moving with eerie precision, like predators that had already decided on their prey. "Contact!" Reynolds shouted, raising his rifle. The rest of the team followed suit, weapons snapping into position. James reached for his own gun, but Lyra suddenly grabbed his wrist. "No," she cried. "Not fight. No win." James hesitated, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What do you mean?" Lyra shook her head desperately. They hear. They feel. Weapons, loud. More come. Many, many." James swallowed hard, realization dawning on him. If they fought now, they wouldn't just be fighting this small group. They'd be drawing in more. An entire army, maybe. "We can't fight them," James said, turning to Reynolds. "Not yet. We need to move." Reynolds scowled. "And go where, exactly?" James looked at Lyra. "She knows." Lyra hesitated, looking between James and the massive creatures approaching them. Then, making a decision, she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the rocks. "Follow," she said urgently. James didn't argue. Everyone. move. The escape. The team sprinted after Lyra as she led them through the narrow canyon, ducking between towering rock formations. Behind them, the creatures let out an unearthly clicking sound, like bones scraping together. The sound sent chills down James's spine. Then, without warning, the hunters moved. They were fast, too fast. One moment they were standing in the distance, and the next they were charging, leaping, sprinting, covering ground impossibly quickly. "Move, move, move," Reynolds shouted. The team ran, but James knew they wouldn't outrun them. These creatures were built for this environment. They knew the terrain. The humans were just intruders, scrambling to survive. Suddenly, Lyra made a sharp turn, disappearing into a crevice between two massive boulders. James followed without hesitation, trusting her instincts. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. The moment James slipped inside, he turned back and saw one of the hunters lunging toward him. For a split second, their eyes met, or at least James thought they did. Then, the creature slammed into the rocks with terrifying force, unable to fit through the tight passage. It let out a furious shriek, clawing at the stone, but it couldn't reach him. James exhaled sharply. Lyra had saved them. A hidden past. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper underground. The air grew damp, the sound of rushing water echoing in the distance. Finally, they emerged into a cavern, a massive underground space, filled with glowing crystals, casting eerie blue light across the walls. Stalactites dripped with moisture, and ancient symbols were carved into the stone. James turned to Lyra. "What is this place?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked toward one of the walls, placing a hand against the carvings. Her expression was unreadable, part pain, part longing. Then, finally, she whispered, "Home." James's heart clenched. "Your people lived here." Lyra nodded slowly. Reynolds stepped forward. "What happened to them?" Lyra turned to face them, her dark eyes filled with sorrow. She placed a hand over her heart and closed her eyes, taking a slow, shaky breath. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Hunters, take them. I run. Only me." Silence fell over the group. James felt his stomach twist. She was the last, the only survivor of her kind. And now, the same creatures that had wiped out her people were hunting them. The final revelation. James looked at the carvings on the walls, scanning the strange symbols. There was something familiar about them, something ancient. And then he saw it. A star map, a detailed map of the entire system, drawn centuries ago. And at the center of it, a single glowing mark. James traced his fingers over it, realization dawning on him. "Lyra," he said carefully, "what is this?" Lyra hesitated, then spoke a single word. "Weapon." James's breath caught. The hunters hadn't just wiped out her people. They had been searching for something powerful. And Lyra was the key. The Empire strikes. The cavern was silent, except for the distant dripping of water and the faint hum of energy pulsing from the glowing crystals in the walls. James ran his fingers over the ancient star map, tracing the single glowing mark at its center. A weapon. That's what Lyra had called it. He turned to her, his mind racing. "Lyra, what kind of weapon?" Lyra hesitated, her dark, shimmering eyes flickering with something between fear and desperation. She reached up, placing her slender fingers on the glowing mark. The crystal pulsed beneath her touch, responding to her as if it knew her, like it had been waiting for her all this time. "Power," she whispered. "Enough to stop them." James didn't need to ask who them was. The hunters, the creatures that had slaughtered her people, the ones now searching for them, were still out there, clawing at the rocks above, waiting for any sign of movement. He glanced at Reynolds, whose face was a storm of emotion, "Captain, we need to figure out what this weapon is and how to use it." Reynolds frowned. "You're assuming it even still works." James looked at Lyra. She wasn't just assuming. She knew. Before Reynolds could argue further, a deep vibration rumbled through the cavern floor. Dust and small stones rained down from above, shaking loose from the ceiling. The team tensed, weapons raised. Then, a distant sound echoed through the tunnels. Boom. A dull explosion, followed by another. And another. James's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. "The enemy arrives." A crackling voice came through Reynolds' communicator. "Base to Delta Team. Come in. We're under attack. Unknown hostiles approaching from." The signal cut out in static. James and Reynolds locked eyes. The hunters hadn't just followed them. They had brought something worse. James turned to Lyra. "We need to get out of here." Lyra shook her head, stepping forward and placing both hands on the crystal in the wall. The glow beneath her fingers intensified, spreading like veins of liquid light. The walls pulsed in response, as if something was waking up beneath the rock. James felt the hair on his arms stand up. The cavern wasn't just a hiding place. It was alive. Lyra looked back at him, urgency burning in her gaze. "No. We make stand. Here." The first attack. Before James could question her, a deafening roar erupted from the tunnel entrance. The first hunter lunged into the cavern, its massive form barely squeezing through the rocky passage. Its smooth, eyeless face twitched as it scanned the room, its claws dripping with some unknown, glowing substance. The team didn't wait. "Fire!" Reynolds shouted. The cavern exploded with gunfire. Bright flashes of plasma rounds lit up the darkness as bullets tore into the hunter's thick, chitinous armor. The creature screeched, stumbling back, but it didn't fall. It adapted. The next shot that hit it barely left a mark. "Damn it," one of the soldiers yelled. "It's learning." More screeches echoed from the tunnel. Then, they rushed in. 5 hunters, moving in perfect synchronization, charged toward them. The ground shook beneath their weight. James pulled Lyra behind a rock, shielding her with his body as the fight erupted. Soldiers ducked behind cover, firing relentlessly, but the hunters were relentless. One of them leaped, landing in the middle of the group. It slashed out with one massive claw. One of the soldiers screamed as he was lifted off the ground and thrown into the wall with bone-crushing force. James cursed, gripping his rifle tighter. He aimed, fired, and nothing. The bullets bounced off. The creature barely flinched. Then, something strange happened. Lyra stepped forward. "Lyra, no." James tried to grab her, but she was faster. She raised her arms, her fingers splaying wide. The air around her shifted. The very energy of the cavern responded to her presence. Then, a pulse of light exploded from her hands. It hit the closest hunter, sending it flying backward. The creature crashed into the stone wall with a sickening crunch, its body twitching before going completely still. Silence. Everyone froze. Lyra collapsed to her knees, breathing hard, her body trembling. James rushed to her side, grabbing her shoulders. What the hell was that? She blinked up at him, her breath ragged. The weapon. James's mind reeled. It wasn't some ancient superweapon hidden in the caves. It wasn't some forgotten piece of alien technology. The weapon was Lyra. A final stand. Before anyone could react, the cavern shook again. But this time, it wasn't from the hunters. It was something bigger. From deep within the tunnels, an eerie, low-pitched sound began to rise. A vibration, a hum, growing in intensity. The hunters stopped their attack, their heads tilting toward the sound. Then, the walls began to glow. The crystals embedded in the stone pulsed with energy, spreading outward from where Lyra had touched them. The ancient carvings on the walls began to shift, as if moving on their own. James's breath caught in his throat. What's happening? Lyra forced herself to stand, her legs shaking. She turned to James, her expression filled with something new. determination. She placed a hand on his chest. You protect. I finish. James's heart pounded. Finish what? Lyra turned to the glowing wall, stepping forward. Reynolds shook his head. James, we need to stop her. We don't know what this will do. James wanted to agree. Every part of him screamed that this was too dangerous, too unknown. But then, he looked at Lyra. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. And he knew, deep down, that this was what she had been running from. This was why she had survived. Not to escape, but to end it. The last choice. The hunters began to shriek. They knew what was coming. They turned, scrambling toward the tunnels, desperate to escape. But it was too late. Lyra raised her arms. The cavern exploded with light. For a single, blinding moment, James saw everything. The entire history of Lyra's people, the rise of the hunters, the destruction of her world, and the last desperate hope her people had left behind. Her, the last survivor, the last weapon. Then, everything went white. The final stand. For a moment, there was nothing but white light. Blinding, endless, consuming. James felt weightless, as if he had been torn from reality and thrown into the heart of a star. The cavern, the hunters, his team, everything had vanished into the sheer, overwhelming brilliance. He tried to move, but there was no ground beneath him, no air to breathe, only light. And then, it shattered. The explosion of light collapsed inward, folding in on itself like a dying star. Reality snapped back into place with a deafening boom as the cavern reappeared around him. The ground trembled. Energy crackled through the air like living electricity. James hit the floor hard, gasping as his lungs filled with air again. His ears rang. His vision blurred. His body felt like it had been thrown through a black hole. But he was alive. The first thing he saw when his vision cleared was the hunters. Or rather, what was left of them. The creatures that had been towering over them just moments ago were now disintegrating. Their chitinous bodies cracked apart like shattered glass, dissolving into streams of glowing energy. Their twisted screams echoed through the cavern as they collapsed, their once indestructible forms crumbling into dust. One by one, the hunters vanished. And then, silence. Lyra's sacrifice. James pushed himself onto his hands and knees, coughing as he tried to process what had just happened. His team was scattered around him, groaning, shaken but alive. Reynolds was slumped against a rock, his rifle still clutched in his hands. The others were dazed, eyes wide with disbelief. But James wasn't looking at them. His gaze locked onto Lyra. She stood at the center of the cavern, her small frame trembling. The light that had once radiated from her skin was fading, flickering like a dying flame. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed to her knees. James was at her side in an instant. Lyra! He caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her against his chest. She was burning up. Her skin, once cool to the touch, now radiated heat like molten metal. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes unfocused. She had done it. She had unleashed the power hidden within the cavern, the weapon of her ancestors. And in doing so, she had wiped out the hunters. But at what cost? James shook his head. You're okay. You're going to be okay. Lyra blinked up at him, her gaze soft, tired. She lifted a trembling hand and touched his face. You, hear me now. James froze. Her voice. It wasn't broken, fragmented like before. It was clear. As if the energy she had released had somehow bridged the gap between them, allowing her words to fully form in his mind. James swallowed hard. Yeah, he whispered. I hear you. Lyra's lips curled into the faintest smile. Good. Then her eyes fluttered closed. A new threat. No, 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 stay with me, James pleaded, shaking her gently. But before he could say another word, a deep rumble shook the cavern once more. James looked up, heart pounding. The crystals in the walls, once vibrant and pulsing with life, began to crack. The ancient energy that had been unleashed was unstable. The entire cave system was coming apart. Reynolds pushed himself to his feet, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need to get out of here. Now." James barely heard him. He was still holding Lyra, her body limp in his arms. She had saved them. She had given everything she had to destroy the hunters. But had she survived? James clenched his jaw. He wouldn't leave her behind. Scooping her up, he rose to his feet. His legs were shaky, his body screamed in protest. But he didn't stop. "Move," Reynolds barked. The team sprinted toward the exit as the cavern collapsed around them. Jagged rocks tumbled from the ceiling, shattering against the floor. The air filled with dust and the deafening sound of destruction. James ran. He didn't stop. Not even when a deafening roar split the air behind him. He chanced a glance back, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice. Something was still alive. Amid the crumbling ruins, one last hunter stood. But it was different. Bigger, stronger, and furious. Its body was wreathed in a dark, pulsing energy, an unnatural force that flickered and twisted around it like a living shadow. The other hunters had been soldiers, predators. But this was a monster, and it was coming for them. The final battle. James tightened his grip on Lyra and forced himself to move faster. The team burst out of the cavern just as the final hunter let out a bone-rattling screech. "Weapons up," Reynolds ordered. The soldiers turned, rifles raised, their hands steady despite the chaos. But James knew bullets wouldn't stop this thing. Not this time. Lyra had been the only one strong enough to destroy them. But now she was unconscious in his arms. James's mind raced. There had to be another way. Some way to turn the tide before they were all slaughtered. Then his eyes landed on the canyon. A plan formed in his mind. "Reynolds," he shouted, "we lure it onto the bridge. Then we blow it." Reynolds's gaze snapped to the narrow rock bridge spanning the canyon just ahead. It was old, unstable, a natural formation that had been weathered by centuries of wind and erosion. It wouldn't take much to bring it down. Reynolds understood immediately. "Everyone, fall back." James set the charges. James sprinted ahead, slinging Lyra over his shoulder and pulling out a set of small demolition charges from his pack. He planted them along the edges of the bridge as the hunter charged toward them. The ground shook beneath its steps. It moved like a nightmare, its massive form shifting unnaturally, its dark energy crackling like lightning. James finished setting the last charge and ran. The hunter leaped onto the bridge just as James and the others reached the other side. James didn't hesitate. He hit the detonator. Boom! The explosion rocked the canyon. The bridge collapsed. For a split second, the hunter's glowing eyes locked onto James. Then it plunged into the abyss. James barely had time to breathe before the canyon went silent. It was over. The aftermath. James collapsed to his knees, exhaustion slamming into him like a tidal wave. His arms ached. His head throbbed. His heart pounded. But they had survived. He looked down at Lyra. She was still unconscious, but her breathing was steady. James exhaled in relief. Reynolds approached, kneeling beside him. "She saved us," he said quietly. James nodded. "Yeah, she did." Reynolds was silent for a moment, then said, "We're not leaving her behind." James looked up in surprise. Reynolds met his gaze. "We take her with us. She's one of us now." James swallowed the lump in his throat. He looked down at Lyra, brushing a stray lock of shimmering hair from her face. She wasn't just an alien. She wasn't just a survivor. She was family. And no matter what came next, James wasn't letting her go. Victory and sacrifice. The wind howled across the ruined canyon, carrying the scent of dust and scorched rock. The bridge was gone, reduced to a pile of shattered stone deep in the abyss below. The final hunter had fallen, consumed by darkness. The battle was over. But James wasn't celebrating. He knelt beside Lyra, cradling her fragile body in his arms. Her breathing was faint, her skin dimming from its usual shimmering glow. She had given everything, her strength, her energy, maybe even her very life, to stop the hunters. And now she was slipping away. James's pulse pounded in his ears. "Lyra," he whispered, "stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake. Reynolds crouched beside him, his face grim. "She needs medical attention. Now." James nodded numbly. But as he looked at her, something deep inside told him that human medicine wouldn't be enough. Lyra wasn't just wounded, she was drained. The power she had unleashed in the cavern had taken more than just her strength. It had taken a part of her soul. And if they didn't do something soon, they were going to lose her. A desperate gamble. James lifted his gaze to the remnants of the ancient cavern behind them. The glowing crystals, once pulsing with energy, had gone dark. The walls were cracked, lifeless. Whatever power Lyra had awakened, it was fading. But something told him it wasn't gone. Not yet. He turned to Reynolds, his voice firm. "I need to go back in." Reynolds frowned. "James, that place is collapsing. You go back in there, you might not make it out." James looked down at Lyra. Her breathing was getting shallower. "I'm not letting her die," he said, his voice unwavering. Reynolds studied him for a long moment. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he reached into his pack and pulled out a flare. "Take this," he said. "And don't do anything stupid." James smirked despite the situation. No promises. Then, with Lyra still in his arms, he turned and ran back into the ruins. The awakening. The cavern was barely holding together. Stones tumbled from the ceiling, cracks spreading across the walls like veins of a dying creature. The once glowing carvings were flickering, dimming, dying. James moved fast, dodging falling debris as he made his way back to the star map. This was the place where Lyra had first activated the energy, where the power of her people had surged through her. If there was anything left, this was where it would be. He knelt down, carefully laying Lyra against the glowing crystal at the center of the map. The energy was faint, but he could still feel it, like an ember in a dying fire. James pressed his palm against the crystal, desperate. "Come on," he murmured. "You brought her here for a reason. Help her." Nothing happened. James's chest tightened. Then, suddenly, light. Faint at first, then growing, pulsing, rising. The crystal beneath Lyra began to glow again, flickering like a heartbeat. The veins of energy spread outward, creeping up her arms, her chest, her face. James felt it. It wasn't just healing her, it was changing her. Then, Lyra gasped. Her body arched as the energy surged into her, her eyes snapping open, glowing white. James stumbled back as the entire cavern exploded with light. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement, just pure, radiant energy filling the space. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it faded. James blinked against the lingering brightness. His heart pounded. Then, Lyra sat up. Her breathing was steady. Her wounds were gone. Her skin glowed brighter than before, pulsing with renewed life. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She was alive. The truth revealed. Lyra looked at James, and for the first time she smiled. He smiled back, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. "You scared the hell out of me," he said. Lyra tilted her head, as if trying to understand his words. Then she reached out, touching his face gently. And James heard her, not with his ears, but with his mind. "Thank you." James froze. Lyra's lips hadn't moved. He could hear her, but she wasn't speaking. He could feel her emotions. Gratitude, warmth, hope. He could feel her connection to the ancient energy of this place. He could feel her. James swallowed. "You can," Talk to me. Lyra nodded, her smile widening. I can now. James exhaled in disbelief. What? What happened to you? Lyra looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers as if feeling them for the first time. The energy still pulsed beneath her skin, but it wasn't unstable anymore. It wasn't burning her up. It belonged to her now. She had become something more. James shook his head, laughing softly. You're full of surprises, you know that. Lyra giggled, a sound so pure and innocent that, for a moment, James forgot about the war, the hunters, the destruction. For the first time since he had found her, she was happy. A new future. They made their way back to the surface, where the rest of the team was waiting. Reynolds raised an eyebrow as he saw them approaching. You're still alive, he said. That's unexpected. James smirked, glad to disappoint. Reynolds looked at Lyra, his expression unreadable. And her. James glanced at Lyra, then back at his captain. She's coming with us. Reynolds sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Of course she is. The team packed up quickly, preparing to leave the planet behind. The hunters were gone. The cavern was collapsing. There was nothing left for them here. But James knew this wasn't the end of Lyra's story. It was only the beginning. As the ship lifted off, Lyra stood by the window, watching the planet shrink beneath them. She turned to James, her voice in his mind once more. Where do we go now? James smiled. Anywhere we want.